The fires came before the sirens did. That was the thing nobody ever talked about afterward. How the sky turned orange and red before a single alarm went off. How the burning started quietly, almost gently, like a sunrise in the wrong direction. And then the ships appeared, dark and heavy, against the pale violet clouds of Aethari Prime. And everything that had been quiet became loud all at once. The settlement of Veilun Crossing was not a military target. It was a farming colony on the outer edge of Aethari territory. A place of long grass fields, soft bioluminescent trees that glowed faintly blue at night, and perhaps 4,000 civilians who had never seen war up close. They grew food, they raised children. They built small homes with wide windows because the sunsets on Aethari Prime were the most beautiful in the known star cluster, and nobody wanted to miss them. The Keth Dominion did not care about any of that. The Keth were pirates in the way that a wildfire is a campfire. Technically the same thing, but the scale made it something else entirely. They had started as a raiding faction 2 generations ago, and had grown into something close to an empire, fed by stolen resources, slave labor, and a culture that mistook cruelty for strength. When they hit a settlement, they did it fast and they did it loud, because fear was a tool they had mastered long before weapons. They hit Veilun Crossing just after the second morning bell. 7-year-old Saraline did not understand what was happening. She understood fire. She understood noise. She understood the way her attendant, a kind older woman named Tavis, grabbed her by the hand and ran without explaining anything, because there was no time to explain. Saraline had been visiting the settlement with a small royal escort, a routine goodwill trip her mother had sent her on as part of her early education. See how people live, her mother had said. Know your people. Now those people were running and screaming, and the sky was full of enemy ships. Tavis pulled Saraline toward one of the emergency transport pods, small sealed evacuation capsules built into the sides of the colony's central structure. They were meant to launch automatically when the building's sensors detected a threat. Tavis shoved Saraline inside and climbed in after her, hit the seal button, and held the girl against her chest while the pod systems hummed to life. The pod launched. It did not go far. Something hit it. Not a direct shot. Maybe debris, maybe a glancing blast from a Keth weapon, but the pod spun hard, cracked against the side of a secondary structure, and came to a grinding stop on the ground, with half its systems dead. The launch hatch was jammed. The distress beacon was dark. The emergency lighting inside flickered once, and then died completely, leaving only the orange glow of the fires outside coming through the small porthole window. Tavis was unconscious. She had hit her head when the pod impacted. Saraline was alone. She pressed herself into the corner of the pod and pulled her knees to her chest and tried very hard not to make any sound. Outside, she could hear boots on the ground. She could hear Keth soldiers talking in their rough, clicking language. She kept her eyes on the porthole and watched the orange light, and tried to remember how to breathe slowly, the way Tavis had taught her during meditation lessons. And she thought that she would very much like to go home now. The boots got closer. She could see one of them now through the porthole, a Keth soldier, big and armored, moving along the outer wall of the building toward the pod. He hadn't seen her yet, but he was looking. They were always looking for valuables in the wreckage after a strike. A sealed pod meant something worth sealing was inside. Saraline closed her eyes. She heard the soldier stop. Then she heard something else, a different sound, coming from further up the alley. A fast, low sound, someone running. The Keth soldier turned. There was a very short, very brutal exchange of sounds. Impact, grunt, something heavy hitting the ground, and then silence. Saraline opened her eyes. A man was crouching in front of the porthole. He was human. She had seen humans before, in diplomatic recordings, and in her schoolbooks, but never one in person. He was shorter than any adult HFY she knew, with no bioluminescence in his skin, no elegant ridge markings along his jaw. He was just skin and muscle, and a uniform that was torn at the shoulder, dark, with something she did not yet understand was blood. His hair was short and dark and damp with sweat. He had a cut above one eye. He looked directly at her through the porthole. His eyes were gray, completely steadily gray, and they were calm in a way that made no sense given the fires and the noise and the dead Keth soldier on the ground behind him. He looked like a man who had simply checked something off a list. He tried the hatch. Jammed. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then moved around to the side of the pod, found the manual release panel, pulled the cover off with his hands, and did something with the wiring inside that Caroline could not see. The hatch opened with a hiss of pressure. He reached in. "Come on," he said. His voice was low and even, not urgent, not panicked, like he was asking her to step through a doorway. "We need to move." Caroline looked at Tavis. "She's hurt. I see her." He was already leaning in, checking the older woman's pulse with 2 fingers, reading her condition in seconds. "She's breathing. I'll come back for her. Right now I need you outside." Caroline did not move. "You don't know if you'll come back." The man looked at her. Just looked, for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not pity. Not impatience. Something quieter than both. "No," he said honestly. "I don't. But I know that if you stay in this pod, there are 3 more soldiers coming around that corner in about 40 seconds, and this door is now open. So the best thing I can do is get you somewhere safe right now, and come back for her as fast as I can. Okay?" Caroline looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his hand. He lifted her out of the pod like she weighed nothing, tucked her against his side, and moved. He moved fast and low and quiet along the outer wall of the building, away from the main fires, checking every corner before he rounded it. When Keth's soldiers appeared at the far end of the alley, he changed direction without hesitating, as if he had already planned for that too. At some point, she never remembered exactly when, she started crying. Just silently, tears running down her face, because she was 7 years old and everything was burning, and she didn't know if her mother was alive. He noticed without looking at her. "Hey," his voice was low, "you're going to be fine. I've got you." She believed him. She did not know why. He was a stranger and he was bleeding, and there were enemy soldiers 40 feet away. None of the logical reasons to believe him were there. But she believed him anyway. He found a sealed storage structure on the colony's north edge, reinforced walls, no windows, heavy door, and got her inside along with 6 other survivors he had somehow collected along the way. He checked the door twice. He gave one of the adult HFY a piece of equipment from his belt and showed them how to use it in about 15 seconds. Then he looked at Caroline one more time. "Stay here," he said. "Don't open the door for anyone but me." "Are you going back for Tavis?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He went back out into the fire. He came back 11 minutes later with Tavis over one shoulder and 2 more survivors behind him. Caroline watched him set Tavis down gently on the floor, check her again, and then move to secure the door. He did not celebrate. He did not rest. He just kept moving, kept working, kept doing the next thing that needed to be done. She watched him, and she thought, "I have never seen anything like you." The Keth withdrew before dawn. Reinforcements from the HFY home fleet arrived and drove them back beyond the outer belt. When the all-clear sounded, and the survivors emerged from the storage structure into the pale morning light, Caroline looked for the human soldier. He was gone. Nobody knew his name. Nobody had thought to ask. There had been no time. And then there had been smoke. And then there had been the chaos of rescue ships, and medics, and officials arriving with forms and questions. He had simply been there, and then he had not. Caroline stood in the ash in the morning light, and she understood, with the very clear logic of a 7-year-old who had just survived something enormous, that she would spend a very long time wondering about those gray eyes and that quiet, impossible calm. She was right. She spent 20 years wondering. 20 years had a way of changing things. The little girl who had pressed herself into the corner of a broken pod was gone. In her place stood Crown Princess Caroline of the HFY Royal House. Tall, composed, bioluminescent skin glowing a steady silver blue that indicated calm authority, the kind that had to be practiced for years before it stopped being a performance and started being real. She wore the diplomatic robes of her house, pale white shot through with threads of gold, and she walked like someone who had learned that the way you entered a room told everyone everything they needed to know about you before you opened your mouth. She entered the main hall of Axis Verant and let them see her. Axis Verant was the largest neutral station in the known cluster, a megastructure that hung in the gravitational center between 4 star systems, belonging technically to no one, which meant that everyone was comfortable using it for things they didn't want associated with their homeworld. It was old, layered, constantly rebuilt and expanded over centuries, so that its architecture was a strange mix of a dozen different species building styles, all stacked on top of each other. Wide Dreth corridors bled into narrow Valori walkways. June hexagonal chambers opened into vast human-built rectangular conference halls. It smelled like recycled air and old alloy, and faintly, whatever 6 different species catering operations were producing simultaneously. Today it was hosting the Conclave of Aligned Species, an emergency summit that had been called in response to the Keth Dominion's rapid expansion into the outer belt systems. 3 settlements destroyed in 8 months, supply lines raided, 2 passenger vessels taken, their crews never returned. The Keth were no longer a regional problem. They were becoming something that required a coordinated answer. And coordinated answers required a room full of species who mostly found each other irritating to agree on something for once. Caroline had been sent as the HFY's lead representative because she was, by most accounts, the best diplomat her house had produced in 2 generations. She was patient. She was precise. She listened more than she talked, which was rarer than it should have been in diplomatic circles. And she had a particular, quiet credibility when the subject of the Keth came up, because she had lived through one of their attacks, even if she had been only 7 years old at the time. And that lived experience carried a weight that prepared speeches never quite matched. The hall was already half full when she arrived. She recognized the broad, gray-scaled forms of the Dreth delegation seated at the far end, conservative, traditional, deeply skeptical of anything that moved fast. The Valori cluster was represented by 3 of their kind, slender and silver-eyed, already engaged in what appeared to be a heated side conversation. The June Collective sent, as always, a single representative who somehow managed to look like they were representing 1,000. Perfectly still, perfectly unreadable, watching everything and reacting to nothing. And then there was the human delegation's seat. It was currently empty. Caroline sat down at the HFY table and arranged her notes. The opening session was due to start in 20 minutes. Around her, the hall filled gradually, the air thickening with the mixed frequencies of multiple species communicating at once. The deep rumble of Dreth, the high tonal chiming of Valori, the soft structured clicks of the June. Translation earpieces distributed by Axis Verant's staff handled the conversions. But Caroline had spent years learning to read body language across species, which often told more than any translation could. Right now, body language was telling her that most of the room was afraid. Not obviously, They were all too practiced for obvious. But she could see it in the small signs. The way the Dreth Elder kept touching the edge of his delegation tablet without looking at it. The way the Valori trio had shifted their chairs slightly closer together. The way even the June representative had one hand flat on the table rather than folded, which for a June was practically a shout of anxiety. The Keth expansion had everyone scared, and scared delegations made poor decisions. She was still thinking about that when the main entrance doors opened again and the human delegation walked in. There were 4 of them, 2 advisors, an aide, and at the front, the man listed on the summit roster as Commander Aaron Voss, Earth Accord Senior Military Envoy. Saraline looked up from their notes. She looked at him the way you look at something your brain hasn't processed yet. A quick, automatic glance, the kind you give to any new arrival entering a room. Professional. Entirely ordinary. And then her mind caught up. She stopped. Everything around her kept moving. Delegates talking, staff arranging chairs, someone near the back dropping a data pad with a clatter. But Saraline sat completely still. Her bioluminescence, so carefully maintained at that steady diplomatic silver blue, flickered once. Just once. A very small thing that anyone who didn't know Athari biology would miss entirely. But to anyone who did know it, that flicker said, shock. She knew those eyes. Gray. Completely, steadily gray. Calm in a way that had no logical right to exist in the middle of a busy, loud, politically charged room. He was older. Of course he was. 20 years was 20 years. The dark hair had threads of silver in it now, and there were lines in his face that hadn't been there before. The kind left by weather and stress, and too many long nights in bad conditions. His uniform was simple and military, no decorations beyond what was functionally required. He moved through the room the same way he had moved through that burning alley 2 decades ago, checking corners without making it look like he was checking corners, noting exits without appearing to note exits. Easy and fluid and completely, terrifyingly aware. He sat down at the human delegation's table without any ceremony whatsoever. He glanced at the room the way you glance at a tactical map, quick, thorough, filed. His eyes passed over Saraline's table without stopping. He did not recognize her. Why would he? She had been 7 years old. She had been one terrified child in the middle of a burning settlement, one of probably dozens of people he had pulled out of danger that day. She was now a grown woman in full royal diplomatic dress, and there was absolutely no reason his eyes should stop on her face, and connected to a small girl crying silently against his side 20 years ago in the smoke. But she remembered him. She remembered every single detail. Saraline became aware that she was gripping the edge of her data tablet too hard. She made herself relax. She made herself breathe. She touched the edge of her robes, a grounding habit from childhood that her tutors had never quite managed to train out of her. And she straightened in her chair and looked at the summit agenda in front of her. The Dreth Elder was already speaking, his voice carrying across the room with the natural weight that Elder Dreth voices carried, deep and slow and certain of their own importance. He was talking about caution. He was talking about measured responses. He was talking, at some length, about the historical record of rushed coalitions and the poor outcomes they tended to produce. Around the room, several delegations nodded. Others looked politely unconvinced. Saraline looked at Commander Voss. He was listening to the Dreth Elder with his hands folded on the table in front of him. He did not fidget. He did not check a screen. He was simply present and listening and thinking, and whatever he was thinking was not visible on his face. One of his aides leaned over and said something quietly. Voss tilted his head slightly in response. Not quite a nod, not quite a shake, just an acknowledgement. Then he went back to listening. Saraline thought, that is the same man. Exactly the same man. 20 years, a different room, a completely different kind of fire. And he is the same. The summit's first session ran for 3 hours. It covered threat assessments, proposed response frameworks, resource commitments, and the usual elaborate dance of species trying to cooperate without appearing to concede authority to each other. It was exhausting in the particular way that only very high-stakes diplomacy could be. Every word carrying more weight than it appeared to carry. Every silence meaning something. During a break in proceedings, Caroline watched Commander Voss pour himself something from the refreshment station, exchange a brief word with one of the June aides, and then stand by the wide viewport at the side of the hall, looking out at the stars. She thought about walking over. She thought about saying something. She rehearsed 3 different versions of it in her head. She did not go. Not yet. There was a summit to hold together first. There were decisions to be made about a very real threat to a very large number of living people. That came first. Her mother had taught her that. Her mother had also survived a Keth attack, and she had said, "You don't get to fall apart until the work is done." Caroline looked back at her agenda. But for the rest of that first session, and the one after it, and the quiet working dinner, where delegates negotiated in smaller clusters over food that none of them entirely trusted, she knew exactly where in the room Aaron Voss was at all times. She was not sure what she was going to say to him. She only knew that she was going to say something. And she knew, with the same clear certainty she had felt as a 7-year-old taking the hand of a stranger in a burning alley, that she could trust whatever happened next. She had always trusted those eyes. The attack came on the second night. Not from outside. That was the part that made it so effective. The Keth had no warships near Axis Variant, not that anyone could detect, anyway, and the station's external defenses were strong enough that a frontal assault would have been expensive and obvious. The Keth, whatever else could be said about them, were not stupid. They did not hit things from the front when they could find a door left unlocked. The door, in this case, was people. 17 station staff members, maintenance workers, catering personnel, 2 security contractors hired 8 months ago through a third-party firm that had, apparently, been compromised. They had been in place long before the summit was announced, which told anyone paying attention that the Keth had planned this for a while. This was not opportunism. This was patience. Caroline was in her quarters, reviewing the next morning's session notes, when the lights changed. Not off. They shifted to emergency amber, and a tone sounded through the station's internal system, 2 short pulses followed by a long one. She had been briefed on Axis Variant's emergency codes during arrival orientation. 2 short, 1 long. Internal security breach. She was already standing and moving for the door when her personal comm chimed. It was her aide, a young Athari named Pellies, voice careful and controlled in the way that meant he was frightened. "Princess, the station has been partially seized. The main conclave hall is locked down. They're saying Keth inside." "Where are the other delegates?" she asked. "Mostly in the hall. Evening session ran late. They're locked in. And you?" "Outer corridor, east wing. I have Counselor David with me and 2 security staff. We're in a maintenance alcove. Do not move until I contact you again." She ended the call and pulled on her outer robe, more for the armor of its formality than any practical protection, and stepped into the corridor. It was quiet in the wrong way. Station corridors were never fully quiet. There was always the background hum of life support, the distant sound of movement. Right now, it was too still. The amber lights made everything look like the inside of a warning. She heard footsteps and pressed herself to the wall. The footsteps were not Keth. She could tell by the pace, too quick and too purposeful. And around the corner came Commander Aaron Voss, moving fast, with one of his aides a step behind him. He was in the same clothes he'd worn to the evening session. No weapon visible, but his eyes were already doing what his eyes always seemed to do, reading every angle of the corridor, cataloging it. He saw her and stopped. Princess. No titles came naturally in a hallway emergency, but she noticed he managed it. You should not be in the corridor. I was told the delegates are sealed in the main hall, she said. They are. Keth took it about 12 minutes ago. Armed team, at least 16 inside, probably more in secondary positions. They've already broadcast a demand. His voice was level, not calm in the way of someone who wasn't feeling anything. She was starting to understand the difference, but calm in the way of someone who had decided that feelings were not useful to the current problem and had temporarily set them aside. They want you. She had expected that. She had expected it the moment she heard the word Keth. In exchange for the delegates. Yes. Then we should discuss whether— No, he said, simply and without apology. We shouldn't. That's not a trade that gets made. It doesn't end well for anyone, even when it appears to. And it definitely doesn't end well for you. He glanced back at the corridor they had come from, then forward at the one ahead. I need to find a place to work from, somewhere with access to internal system nodes and a line of sight to the east maintenance tunnels. I know a place, Caroline said. He looked at her for 1 second, then said, Lead. She led him to the station archive room, 3 levels down, a place she had discovered the previous afternoon, while taking a walk to settle her thoughts before the evening session. It was small, dim, packed with physical databanks that nobody used anymore, and it had exactly the kind of access panel that Voss needed. She had not known she would need it for this. She had simply noticed it, the way she always noticed things. Voss's aide, a young man named Carver, who had the look of someone who had been through this kind of night before, immediately began working the access panel. Voss pulled out a small device that projected a soft light map of the station's internal layout, and stood over it, thinking. Within 20 minutes, the archive room had become a command post. Voss reached out through the station's emergency channels, and found 4 other people who were loose in the corridors and willing to work. 2 of his own delegation staff, an Axis variant maintenance engineer who knew the service tunnels better than anyone, and, unexpectedly, the June representative, who appeared at the door without any explanation and simply sat down and began providing information in precise, structured sentences. They just did. The Dreth Elder and the Valerie delegation were inside the locked hall with the rest of the hostages. So was most of the Aetheri security staff that had accompanied Caroline to the summit. The Keth had timed the seizure well. Caroline watched Voss work. She had been in many rooms with many commanders and military advisors over the years of her diplomatic career. She knew how most of them operated, with clear chains of authority, with deference to rank, with the kind of organized process that worked well when there was time and fell apart when there wasn't. Voss did not operate that way. He gave information more than orders. He asked questions that made other people arrive at conclusions themselves. He drew things on the projected map with his finger and said, "What do you think about this route?" rather than "take this route." And somehow the end result was that everyone in the room was moving in the same direction without anyone having been told to. She noticed he also kept an eye on her, not watching over her in the way of someone managing a liability, more the way of someone who has added another variable to their calculations and is making sure that variable is accounted for. At one point, when Carver and the June were deep in a discussion about the station's ventilation grid, Voss moved to stand near her. "The Keth commander's specific demand was you by name," he said quietly. "Not just a royal hostage, you specifically. Which means they knew the delegation roster before they moved, and they knew your significance. This was planned around you being here." "My government will have worked that out as well," Caroline said. "They'll be sending ships." "Ships take time. We have people in that hall right now." "I know." She paused. "What are you planning?" "A way in. The east maintenance tunnels run adjacent to the hall's secondary wall. There's a junction point that sits behind the Keth's likely interior positions. They'd have the main doors covered, the ventilation checked. But maintenance access points are always the ones that get overlooked. I want to use that. Going in. Going in, he confirmed. She looked at him. How many people? Small group, 3 or 4, big enough to create a distraction, small enough not to be heard getting into position. He said it like it was a math problem, like the part where people might be shot at was just one variable among several. You'll need a reason for them to look at one place while the others move, she said. Yes, I can give you that. How? They want me. If I contact them, use the station's communication system to open a channel, make them think I'm offering to negotiate my own surrender. Their attention will be on the communication point, not the wall. Voss was quiet for a moment. It was a particular kind of quiet that she had started to recognize in him. Not hesitation, not doubt, but the brief pause of someone running every version of a scenario quickly and checking the results. That works, he said. But the moment they think it's a play, they'll move on the hostages. Timing matters. Then we need to be precise. Yes. He looked at her with something new in his expression. She couldn't entirely name it. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like recognition, the specific expression of someone who has just identified an ally they didn't know they had. You're not what I expected from a royal diplomat. You're not what most people expect from anything, she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible, gone almost immediately. But it was there. They worked through the night with the lights amber and the station quiet, and the weight of 60+ lives locked behind a door, pressing on every decision. Carver and the maintenance engineer mapped the tunnel route with painstaking care. The June representative provided what felt like an impossible amount of precise information about Keth tactical patterns, without ever explaining how they knew it. Saraline drafted and revised the communication script 4 times, until Voss said it was exactly right. At some point past the 3rd hour, one of Voss's aides fell asleep sitting against the wall, and nobody disturbed him. Voss himself did not sleep. He drank water, ate something from a ration pack with the mechanical efficiency of someone fueling a vehicle, and kept working. Saraline watched him and thought about a child sitting in an ash-covered settlement and wondering about gray eyes. She had imagined, sometimes, over the years, what she might say if she ever found him. She had imagined something meaningful and composed, the kind of thing a princess who had spent 20 years in diplomatic training would say. Perfectly chosen words that would convey the precise weight of what that day had meant. Now he was 3 feet away from her, planning how to walk into a room full of armed Keth soldiers, and she thought, there is never going to be a perfect moment. Commander, she said. He looked up from the map. She held his gaze. Before you go in there, I need to tell you something. He waited. 20 years ago, she said. Athari Prime, the settlement of Valun Crossing. There was a Keth raid. A transport pod, jammed against the side of a building, on fire. She paused. I was inside it. I was 7 years old. The room was very quiet. Carver had stopped moving. Even the June, who gave away nothing, seemed to still. Voss looked at her. Something moved behind those gray eyes, slow, reaching back across a long distance. I remember the fire, he said. His voice was quiet. There was a child. The hatch was jammed. He paused. And an older woman inside. Head injury. Tavis, Saraline said. She survived. She's alive. She retired 3 years ago and grows flowers outside the capital. Voss was still for a moment. Then, I'm glad, he said, plainly and genuinely, the way he seemed to say most things. You disappeared before I could ask your name. I spent 20 years wondering. I didn't know that, he said. I know. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had looked at the map, reading it honestly. Then he said, I'm glad you made it, both of you. It was not the most elaborate thing anyone had ever said to her. It was not poetic, It was not even particularly long. But it was real in the way that the fire had been real, and the gray eyes had been real, and Caroline found that it was enough. More than enough. "Come back from this," she said. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he picked up his comm, nodded to Carver, and began moving toward the door. "That's the plan," he said. The maintenance tunnel smelled like machine oil and recycled air and old metal. Voss moved through it at the front of a line of 4. Behind him was Carver, then the station maintenance engineer, a squat, competent Aethari named Grant, who had worked on Axis Variant for 11 years and knew every pipe and junction in the East Wing by memory. And at the back, unexpectedly, the June representative, who had announced their intention to come along with the same calm certainty they announced everything, and who nobody had tried to talk out of it because there had not seemed to be any point. Voss had given each of them a specific task. He had not asked if they were afraid. He had not given a speech. He had simply said, "Here is what we are doing, here is what each of you does, here is what we do if any part of it goes wrong." Short and clear, the way a good map is clear. No unnecessary detail, nothing left out. He had also said, "If at any point you need to stop, stop. Tell me immediately. I will adjust. There is no version of this where I leave someone behind." The maintenance engineer had looked at him with something like wonder when he said that, like he had not expected it and did not quite know what to do with it. They moved in silence. Brent led them to the junction point, a section of wall no wider than a standard doorway, behind which the main conclave hall sat on the other side of 6 inches of station alloy. From here, they could hear things. Voices, mostly Keth, moving and irregular. The occasional sound of something being shifted or dropped. No screaming, which Voss noted carefully, in the way that you note the absence of something that would tell you how much time you have. The plan had 3 moving parts. The first was Caroline. Back in the archive room, she was opening a direct communication channel to the Keth commander inside the hall, using her own verified royal identification code, which the Keth would recognize because they had been looking for her. Her job was to hold that channel, to sound like she was negotiating, to keep the Keth commander talking and focused on the comm point at the north end of the hall, which was as far from the east wall as the room allowed. The second was the entry. Grant had identified a maintenance access hatch in the junction, sealed but not locked, because station maintenance access points were never locked from inside the service tunnels. It opened inward, into the hall itself, behind a storage column, a 3-foot gap between the column and the east wall. If the Keth had positioned themselves the way Voss expected they had, and the Juin had confirmed they likely had, that column would provide initial cover. The third was Voss's own improvisation, which was not so much a plan as a permission he gave himself. When things changed, because things always changed, he would adjust. They reached the hatch. Voss pressed his hand flat against the alloy wall and listened. He counted voices. He mapped the rough positions in his head. Then he looked back at his team. 3 faces in the dim amber light of the tunnel, all watching him. He held up 3 fingers. Counted down. 2. 1. The hatch opened without a sound, because Grant had spent 40 minutes on the hinges, with a lubricant he'd pulled from a maintenance supply crate, which was the kind of preparation that never looked impressive and always mattered. They came through fast and low. The storage column covered them for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. The Keth soldiers inside the hall were indeed focused on the north end. Every head was turned toward the comm station, where Caroline's voice was coming through, composed, measured, offering conditions. The Keth commander was at the north wall, back to the east side, a large alien in heavy armor, with the posture of someone who thought he was completely in control of his situation. He was about to stop thinking that. What followed was fast and loud and not clean. It was never clean, Voss had learned that early, and accepted it with the practicality of someone who had stopped expecting otherwise. Carver and Grant moved on the two soldiers nearest the hostage cluster. The June, who turned out to have capabilities that had not been previously disclosed and that nobody asked about afterward, handled the door guards. Voss moved for the commander. The Keth commander was bigger. That was simply true, and not something that changed the situation. He turned fast, he had a weapon up fast, and he was fast for his size. Voss had been in enough fights to know the first half-second was the most important half-second, and he used it by not going where the weapon was pointing. The fight was short. It was not pretty. Voss took a hit to the left side that he knew, in the way of someone who had been hit before, was going to matter later. He filed it under later and kept moving. The hostages were screaming now, not in panic, but in the particular explosive volume of people who have been terrified and silent for hours and suddenly see a reason to move. The Dreth Elder's voice rose above the rest, enormous and carrying, calling order to his people. Several of the Valerie were already on the floor, which was tactically correct, even if it wasn't intentional. There were 3 Keth soldiers who had not been in the initial positions. They came from the service corridor on the north side, reserve, covering their own approach, something the June had noted as a possibility that hadn't been confirmed. Carver went down on one knee. A low blast caught his leg, not through the leg, but he went down. Voss moved without stopping. He pulled Carver behind the storage column, checked the wound in 2 seconds. Not through, not arterial, going to hurt badly, but not immediately dangerous. Pressed Carver's own hand against it, and said, "Hold that, stay low." Then he came back out. The Dreth Elder did something unexpected. He stood up to his full height, and Dreth at full height were genuinely impressive, and he put himself in front of the remaining hostages, with his arms spread. Not as a weapon, just as a wall of gray-scaled presence and sheer refusal to move. The Keth soldiers hesitated, because that kind of determined stillness in the middle of chaos was hard to read. And hard to read things cost half a second. And half a second was enough. Voss used the half second. The last 2 Keth soldiers were down. The Keth commander was immobilized on the floor, conscious, staring up at the ceiling, with the expression of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew. The hall went quiet. Then one of the Valerie delegates started talking very fast in their own language, which the translation earpieces rendered as a stream of disbelief and statistical estimates about survival probability that were frankly not useful right now, but were apparently how Valerie processed shock. Voss walked to Carver, checked him again. "Medic," he said to the room, and it was not a request so much as an instruction directed at the universe in general, which happened to work, because one of the Dreth delegation had medical training and was already moving. Then he leaned against the wall next to Carver and did something none of the watching aliens expected. He exhaled. A long, slow, controlled breath, the kind you take after something hard is over, and your body needs to remember that it can ease off now. And then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Well, that was unpleasant." Carver laughed. It was pained and short, and he immediately hissed at the pain it caused his leg, but it was a real laugh. The Dreth Elder was standing a few feet away, still breathing harder than he would have liked anyone to notice. He was watching Voss with an expression that had never been on his face during the summit deliberations. Something older and simpler. "You are injured," the Elder said. "Yes," Voss said. He looked down at his left side. The hit was making itself known in earnest now. Not critically. "You came through the wall," the Elder said. "Maintenance tunnel. There's a hatch behind the storage column." The Elder seemed like he wanted to ask more questions, but had not yet processed which ones. He looked at the Keth commander on the floor, then at Carver, then at the hatch in the east wall, then back at Voss. "You are a small species," the Dreth Elder said. It was not an insult, It was the observation of someone genuinely working through something. Relatively, Voss agreed. Short-lived, by most standards. You do not have natural armor, enhanced senses, you heal slowly. The elder's deep voice was careful, like he was reading from a list he had compiled over many years. There is no logical biological reason for you to be. He stopped, gestured broadly at the room, at the unconscious Keth, at Carver at the hatch in the wall. This. Voss was quiet for a moment. We've had a long time to practice surviving things we shouldn't, he said, and we have a bad habit of deciding that what we should or shouldn't be able to do isn't as important as whether something needs doing. He paused. You were in front of those people, with your arms out. You didn't have to do that. The elder was quiet. That's not nothing either, Voss said. The Keth commander, still on the floor, turned his head and looked at Voss. His translator crackled and produced words in a tone that was half contempt and half something that wasn't quite either of those things. What are you? Voss looked at him calmly. The product of a species that never had the option to give up. We survived ice ages and plagues and every war we ever started, and we're still here. You picked the wrong station and the wrong summit. He straightened, and the movement cost him. The left side made itself heard clearly, but he straightened all the way. It's over. The Keth commander said nothing more. The station's external defenses had already signaled the approaching Athari relief fleet, which arrived in the outer docking ring 40 minutes later. Axis Varant security personnel flooded the conclave hall. The hostages were accounted for, all alive. The Keth inside the station were secured. Voss was still on his feet when the medics arrived, which impressed them and frustrated them in equal measure, because people who were still on their feet, on pure determination, tended to be harder to treat. He let them work without argument, which was the concession he offered in exchange for being allowed to remain vertical for another few minutes. The alien delegates gathered in the hall, shaken, some of them visibly, and the Dreth elder stood at their center and looked at the small group that had come through the wall. He looked for a long time. Then he stepped forward and bowed his head. It was a Dreth gesture of the highest formal respect, the kind given to things that had earned it beyond any argument. He had never given it to a human before. The Valori delegates, after a moment, did the same. Then the June, precise and unhurried. Voss observed this from the wall he was leaning against, and he looked mildly uncomfortable with it, the way he seemed to be mildly uncomfortable with most forms of ceremony. He accepted it with a nod that carried its own kind of quiet weight. Carver from the floor said, "He hates this part." Nobody laughed, but several of them came very close. The medical bay on Axis Varant was not built for human physiology. This was not unusual. Most facilities in the cluster were built around the majority species that used them, and humans were recent enough arrivals to the wider galactic stage that accommodation of their specific biology was still, in many places, an afterthought. The bed was too wide, and the lighting too blue, and the automated care systems kept suggesting treatments appropriate for Athari metabolic rates, which Voss's assigned medic, a young Athari woman who was doing her best, kept having to override manually. Voss lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, and did not complain about any of it. The injury to his left side was 3 cracked ribs and a deep tissue impact that had bruised muscle down to the bone. The medic had also found an older injury on his right shoulder, improperly healed, the kind that came from a wound treated in the field without proper resources, and then simply lived with. She had made a note about it, with an expression that suggested she found this personally offensive. He had also, apparently, been operating with a low-grade infection from a cut on his forearm that he had not mentioned to anyone. This had earned him a long look from the medic, that he received without apology. "How are you feeling?" she asked, after she had finished her work and was entering notes into her datapad. "Functional," he said. "That is not the answer to that question. It's the most accurate answer." She sighed. a very specific kind of sigh that Saraline recognized when she arrived in the doorway, because she had made the same sound herself on several occasions when dealing with people who refused to admit they were in pain. Saraline stopped at the doorway. The medic noticed her, recognized her, and stepped back from the bed with a small bow. "Princess, he is stable. The ribs will need 3 weeks minimum. He should not be walking around for at least—" "I understand," Voss said to the ceiling. "At least 2 days," the medic finished, directing this firmly at him rather than at Saraline. Then she excused herself with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided to let someone else handle this for a while. Saraline pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Through its single small viewport, the outer stars were hard and clear, the kind of clean, cold star field you saw at this distance from any sun. No atmosphere to soften the light. "Carver?" she asked. "Out of surgery an hour ago. Leg is intact. He'll complain about the scar for years." A pause. "He likes scars, actually. He'll probably enjoy it." "Brent, the maintenance engineer, he's asking if he can visit." "He can visit." The June representative left a message. They wanted to say, she paused, reading from her comm, that working alongside you was instructive, and that they would like to know formally that their assessment of humanity's utility to the Conclave has been revised upward significantly. Voss almost smiled. High praise. From a June, that is essentially a standing ovation. Saraline set her comm down. The Dreth Elder requested a formal meeting with the full human delegation tomorrow. He wants to discuss command authority frameworks for the Coalition fleet. I heard. 3 days ago he argued that humans should have no command authority at all. People change their minds when the facts change, Voss said. He said it without judgment, without satisfaction, just as an observation. Saraline looked at him for a long moment. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "That it takes something like last night for them to see what's in front of them?" He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. He did not dismiss the question. "No," he said finally. "I don't need people to believe in us before we do the thing. I just need to do the thing." A pause. "If it helps them believe in us afterward, that's useful, but it wasn't the reason." Then what was the reason? He turned his head and looked at her. There were people in that room. They needed help. So simple it almost felt like it couldn't be the whole answer. And yet, sitting in that medical bay, in the quiet after everything that had happened, she thought it probably was. "I owe you an apology," she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "I have thought about you for 20 years, she said. "About what you did that day. And I have imagined many times the things I would say if I found you. Something meaningful. Something that would properly explain what it meant. Not just to me, but to who I became. The choices I made. The career I chose." She looked at her hands for a moment. "And then you were actually here. And the station was under attack. And the things I had planned to say seemed entirely wrong for every version of the moment." "Most prepared things are," he said. "Yes," she looked up. "What I actually mean to say is this. I became a diplomat because of that morning on Ethari Prime. Because I watched someone do something I did not have words for as a child. And I spent the years after looking for words. What I eventually decided was that it was not strength. You were strong, yes, but that is not the thing that stays with me. It was that you never seemed to ask whether those people were worth saving. You just knew they were. You just went." She stopped. He was watching her quietly. "I became a diplomat," she said, "because I wanted to build a galaxy where that certainty was not needed so often, where fewer children sit in burning pods. A breath. You gave me a direction. I wanted you to know that." The room was very quiet. Voss was still for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, but there was a weight beneath the evenness that she could hear now, after 2 days of learning to read him. "I didn't know I did any of that," he said. "I know. I remember that morning as—" he paused, reaching for the words. I was in the area on an escort contract. The attack started, and there were people in the open, and it seemed wrong not to do something about that. I pulled a few people out of bad spots. The pod was one of them. He looked at the ceiling. I don't remember it as something particular. The most important things rarely feel that way to the person doing them, Caroline said. He considered that. Maybe, he said. Not maybe, she said gently. That is simply true. Ask anyone in that hall last night what last night felt like to them. Then ask yourself what it felt like to you. A long pause. That's fair, he said. Outside, in the main body of the station, the work of the aftermath was continuing. Officials were processing the detained Keth. Engineers were repairing the internal systems that had been compromised. Delegates were recovering, debriefing, communicating with their home governments. In 12 hours, the conclave would reconvene, this time with a different atmosphere entirely, and the coalition would be formed with a speed and unanimity that would later seem almost unremarkable, though it was anything but. The thing about crisis, Caroline had observed over her career, was that it sometimes accomplished in hours what diplomacy could not accomplish in years. Not because fear was a good foundation for cooperation, it wasn't, not long-term, but because shared experience built something that shared paperwork never quite could. The delegates in that hall had all been afraid together. They had all watched the same small team come through a wall for them. That did not disappear when the lights came back on. She stayed in the medical bay for another hour. They talked, easily, the way she had not entirely expected, about small things and larger things in no particular order. He asked about Tavis genuinely, and she told him about the flower garden and the house outside the capital and the 3 children Tavis had raised, and he listened with the focused attention he seemed to give everything. She asked him about the decade between Aethari Prime and now, and he gave her the compressed version, which was still substantial, and from which she understood that he had spent most of his adult life in exactly the kind of situations that the Conclave Hall had just briefly been. He had done this, quietly, in dozens of places, and almost nobody had written it down. She was going to do something about that. She didn't say so yet, but she noted it with the part of her mind that kept track of things to be done. When she left, she paused at the door. The coalition fleet departs in 4 days, she said. After the command agreements are signed, I have been asked to be present for the departure ceremony. I'll be vertical by then, he said, with the certainty of someone who had no interest in an argument with his own body. The medic said 2 weeks at minimum. She said 2 days before I can walk around. The fleet doesn't leave for 4. Caroline looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. It came out fully and without restraint, not the controlled diplomatic expression of amusement she had spent years cultivating, but a real laugh. It surprised him too, she could tell. I'll see you at the ceremony, she said. He did see her at the ceremony. He was vertical, as promised, standing at the head of the human delegation on the main docking deck of Axis Verant, while the gathered delegates and station staff lined the wide observation corridor. He was moving carefully, because 3 cracked ribs were not resolved in 4 days regardless of determination. But he was standing straight, and his expression was the same clear, steady thing it always was. The coalition fleet was impressive. Aethari vessels were elegant and long-lined, built for speed. Dreth warships were heavy and dark, built for permanence. The Valori crafts were narrow and fast, built for precision. And the human ships, a carrier group, 3 destroyers, 2 support vessels, were blocky and utilitarian, and powerful in the way of things designed entirely around function. They were at the front of the formation. That had been the Dreth Elder's specific suggestion, which he had made in the morning's final session, with a particular tone of someone who had finished thinking about something and arrived at a firm conclusion. Nobody had disagreed. The fleet's departure sequence ran smoothly. Ships released from their docking clamps, engines lit. The formation came together in the space beyond the station, with the slow, steady grace of practiced coordination. Through the wide viewport of the observation corridor, the assembled crowd watched in silence. Then the lead human carrier rotated slowly on its axis as it prepared for the jump sequence, and the crowd saw the port side of its hull for the first time. Someone had painted something on it. The script was a Thari, the flowing, curved writing of Saraline's homeworld, rendered large enough to read clearly from the observation corridor. It was painted in white against the carrier's dark hull, and it was 4 words. Saraline stood very still. She had authorized the painting 3 days ago, in a quiet conversation with the carrier's captain that she had not mentioned to anyone. She had chosen those 4 words specifically. She had thought about other phrases, grander ones, more formal ones that spoke of unity and valor and the things coalitions were supposed to stand for. She had considered and discarded all of them. She had come back to the 4 words that had mattered the most, on the morning that had mattered the most, when she had been 7 years old and the stars were burning and a stranger with gray eyes had told her, "You're going to be fine. I've got you." Voss stood beside her. He read the words on the hull. She felt rather than saw the stillness that came over him. Not the alert stillness of someone reading a situation, but something slower, something that had nothing to do with tactics. "You're going to be fine." The fleet jumped to FTL. The stars stretched and blazed, and then the ships were gone, leaving only the star field and the quiet. The Dreth Elder stood several paces away. He read the words. Then, softly, in his deep and careful voice, he said, "A good thing to carry into the dark." Saraline agreed. Beside her, Voss said nothing. But when she glanced at him, the gray eyes were not entirely unmoved, and for a man who had spent his life setting feelings aside in favor of the next thing that needed doing, she thought that was probably enough. She thought it was, in fact, everything.